I've started up a new UiPath project, and I'm calling this MUT006 Numeric and Converting Variables. And it's been a long time since my last video, so long that my UiPath Studio screen looks a little bit different from my last video. That's one great thing about UiPath. They're constantly upgrading UiPath Studio to make it better. That's also one bad thing about UiPath. If you're watching a UiPath video tutorial made 3 or more years ago, as hard as UiPath tries to make it as backward compatible as possible, a lot of the older videos are now a little outdated. Looking at the Activities panel here on the left, we can see that I've folded up all the categories. Clicking on the More Actions, we can see that I have checked the Group by Category. And we see the 4 categories here: Available, Installed, Recent, and Favorites. If you don't see Favorites, it might be because you haven't added anything to your favorites. To add an activity to Favorites, just right-click on it. I'm going to right-click on Log Message, Add to Favorites. Now we see it in the Favorites as well as the Recent. To remove from the Favorites, I'll right-click on it and click Remove from Favorites. And it's gone. But I actually want that in the Favorites, so I'm going to right-click on it and add it back into the Favorites. I'm going to add in a multiple assign and hold down Control and click K to set a new variable, and I'll add this variable str_number1. And I'll give this variable a value of 6. And I'll add another string variable, again using Control K to set the variable str_number2. And I'll give this variable the number 7. Now we have 2 numbers that have come into our process as strings, but we want to do some math with these numbers, and we cannot do arithmetic on string values. So there's a couple of ways to get around this. One way is to convert the strings to numeric values, like integers. So I will come down to the variables here and add in some integer values. I'll call the first one int_number1, and I'll make this an integer 32. And I'll add another one here, int_number2. And that one as well, I'll make an integer. I'm going to add another multi-assign. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set the integer number 1 to the value of string number 1. And we'll do the same thing with integer number 2 to string number 2. And clicking off that, we don't see any errors. We don't see any errors, and I want to run this. I've moved the output window to the bottom left here. So when we run this, we can see the output. And we see the error: we cannot assign from system string to system int32. We can't do that directly, but we can move the string value into the integer. I'm going into the expression editor. And in the natural language box here, I'm going to type in convert str_number1 to int number1. And then I'll click on the generate expression arrow. And here it tells us cint for convert integer to str_number1. And then it's moving it back to a string, which we don't need. So I'm going to take that part off, and I'll click Save. I'm also going to convert string 2 to an integer, but this time I'm going to use convert.toInt32 and then the string number 2. So why am I using two different ways of converting from string to integer? That's because I want to make you aware that with UiPath, often there are multiple ways of doing the same thing. In this case, we see that there are two ways of converting a string to an integer. Now that we have our numbers converted to integers, I want to do some math on them. And I'm going to paste in some code here from another UiPath Studio IDE I have open. Yes, we can have more than one UiPath Studio open at the same time. We can only have one of them running at a time, but we can have multiple open. I'm going to right-click and copy this sequence and paste it here. And we see when I pasted that in, it also added in this DBL div total as a type double. If I click this drop down, we do see system double in here now, but normally it's not in there, and I'll have to go into browse for types. From here, I would just type double, and it shows there's a lot of them, but if I add system.double, now we only have one. And I would click to select this and click OK, and it would add it to our variable right here. And don't let the browse for types intimidate you. We'll be doing plenty of that in this tutorial series, so you'll get used to it. Now I'm going to run this code, and then we'll take a look at what I added in. I'm going to close this bottom panel here. And we'll start with the sequence that we added in. So the first thing we do here is we log the value of integer number 1, which we see over here on the left is 6. Then this second one logs the integer number 2, which we see is the number 7. And our third activity here just adds integer number 1 to integer number 2, then converts that result to a string so it can be shown here in our output panel. Now this next activity is interesting because it shows that we don't really need the integer variables. We can just convert the string to integer in the equation when we want to use that string as an integer. And we see that over here with convert to integer, string number 1, and then multiply that by converted to integer number 2, which equals 42. So this does work, but it adds more clutter to the equation. I find it more simpler and easier to read up here the integer number 1 plus integer number 2 versus the convert to integer and then do your math. So in short, we don't need the integer variables at all, but I add them because I find it easier to read the equations when the string variables are converted to numeric variables. So our next activity is interesting because the result of integer number 1 divided by integer number 2 is a decimal. But that decimal number is converted to string and printed out here in the output panel. Which brings us to the assign type of double. What we're doing here is saving the result of integer number 1 divided by integer number 2 into a variable. Now this variable cannot be an integer because we have decimal places. So I'm using the variable type of double. And double comes from the C programming language, where the double variable is able to store double the precision of a C programming language floating point variable. There's no float variable in UiPath, but we still use the double precision variable name. So that's where that double comes from and why it's called double. Now, this second part here, we're using the math round. I'm going into the expression editor so we can get a better look at this. And how I came up with this expression was, again, I clicked in the natural language expression editor box here, and I typed in round to 2 decimal places int number 1 divided by int number 2. Then again, I clicked on this convert to expression. And that's how I got the math round. And then it has my result here. And then the comma 2 is 2 decimal places. So it's saying round this entire part here to 2 decimal places. And I can either save or cancel. It's the same thing either way. And that brings us to the last activity, which just logs out the double div equals our rounded to 2 decimal places, 0.86. So that's our introduction to numeric and converting variables. In the next UiPath tutorial, we're going to analyze this code.